I'll talk a little bit about youth engagement today and leveraging youth adult partnerships. And so just want to say thank you for this opportunity to share more with you. I'm going to speak mostly from my perspective, having worked with the federal government as well as federal grantees on their efforts to work in partnership with young people. Some of what I share today might be new to folks here, but I think a fair amount of it might be either material that you've considered already or may want to just, take a few minutes to pay more attention to, at least for now. And so hopefully it'll be helpful. So why don't we go to the next slide? Let's see. So why don't we start with a definition of youth engagement? I would love to hear from you how you define the term youth engagement. So why don't you use the chat? And just for the context of this conversation, when we're talking about youth engagement, I'm thinking about youth adult partnerships as well. So how do you define that term? We're about to test my skills with Zoom to see if I can also see the chat. Let's see. Okay, I'm starting to see some responses here. Co-creating policies, practices, and programs. Yep, that's one. Having youth voice at the table. Okay. And feel free if you'd like to come off the mic if one person wants to speak up, one or two people out loud. We have enough time for that. I think I could see better now. Getting student buy-in, yes. Truly listening to youth voice and valuing their input, yes. Absolutely, absolutely. So I'm seeing really good responses in the chat, which is great. So before I go a little bit further, Brian or Nicole, would it be possible for me to switch and have one of you push the slides forward? So I'm having a little trouble with my screen right now. Is that a possibility?
If you give me a minute, I can pull your slides up on my computer. It'll just take a second, and then you would just tell me when to advance. Would that be fine?
Okay, that'd be great. Thank you.
Okay.
That way, I also can look at more of the comments in the chat here. So I'm seeing really good responses. Youth engagement means providing opportunities for student voice. We always say PBS, voice and choice. Thank you, Michael. Have youth actively involved in the process? Great. Engagement is not just hands-on, but more importantly, minds-on. Ignite curiosity and intellectual opportunity. Ooh, some of you could have done this whole presentation for me. This is great. Students reporting a sense on belongingness. Belongingness is definitely a part of it. I won't touch on that today, but that's a part of it. And then students being valued as creators and youth co-creation. That definitely hits the nail on the head in terms of how I think about youth adult partnerships. So as I mentioned, I'm going to speak to you mostly from the perspective of, someone who's been working in partnership with school systems and others that have been involved in engaging youth as partners. I got my teeth cut in the systems of care world, which focused primarily on engaging the mental health system and schools and primary care providers and others who were really interested in transforming systems and engaging young people in meaningful ways. And so I was hooked from the very first moment I sort of learned of an opportunity to engage young people in a way that felt meaningful and that wasn't really performative. And so I've been doing this work ever since I got that first opportunity. So I'll share a little bit more about how I think about some kind of basic ideas around youth engagement. And if we have enough time, maybe we can even talk a little bit about an example. Next slide, please, Brian. And thank you for pulling up the slides on your end. All right, so so I've seen the term, different things about where the term "nothing about us" really comes from. And I've, seen some people trace it to South African disability rights advocates in the 1980s. I've seen some trace it to politics in 16th century Central Europe. And I'm sure there are others who are more qualified than me to really trace down where this language started. But I learned about the term when working with young people in the system of care context and the children's mental health space that I mentioned. And they used to talk about nothing about us without us as a rallying cry for demanding, really, that their voices be heard, be respected, be included in decisions that impacted their lives. And this included anything from policy to decisions on an organizational level, as well as their individual treatment planning. They really wanted to not just have things done to them, but really to have things done with them. So that's where I first learned the terminology of nothing about us without us. And then I heard family members also using the same language, but I first heard it with young people. All right, next slide. And so one of the organizations that was really critical at that point, that where I sort of cut my teeth a bit, is Youth Move National. And they're now a real bona fide national organization that provides technical assistance and works with chapters of young people all around the country, all involved in systems change. And it started with a voice of young people saying, hey, we care, we want to be involved, we want to help shape systems. We don't want to just have adults doing all this work, adults who used to be young. We want to be the young people of today who are helping to shape these systems. And so they grew and blossomed into this big organization. I'm not involved directly with Youth Move National now, but I am an admirer of the way that they've grown and really continue to engage young people in a meaningful way. They empower young people to become partners in improving and transforming systems that serve youth. And so that includes the education system, mental health, juvenile justice, child welfare, and so on. And so these possibilities really started, as I mentioned, with them just saying, hey, something feels off in these systems that are serving us, but not really engaging us as partners. And so on the next slide, we see, that youth adult partnerships require that youth and adults share power, right? So if we go to the next slide, Ryan, thank you. What does it mean to share power? I've definitely seen and heard different conceptions of what it means to share power. So I'll share a framework that I appreciate. This, I got this from the youthpower.org organization, which is a USAID funded group. They say that meaningful youth engagement really is an inclusive, intentional, mutually respectful partnership between youth and adults, whereby power is shared, respective contributions are valued, and young people's ideas, perspectives, and skills and strengths are integrated into the design and delivery of programs, strategies, policies, funding mechanisms, and organizations that affect their lives and their communities. And that's on the country level, that's globally. There's not really a limit to what's possible here. And they talk about how meaningful youth engagement recognizes and seeks to change the power structures that prevent young people from being considered experts in regard to their own needs and priorities, while also building their leadership capabilities or capacities. And they say that youth includes a full spectrum of the population, and they go from as young as age 10 all the way up through age 29. And I know you may be looking at a smaller age range than that, but that's how they define the term. And they also include, youth from all different socioeconomic statuses, ethnic identities, sexual orientations, gender identities, disabilities, political affiliations, physical location, it's really extensive. And I might add too that it's not really just about young people engaged in a pretty creative project here and there or doing a great social media campaign, although those are fine, but it's really expansively thinking about how to really partner with young people to shape these systems that serve them. So next slide. Excuse me. Now, I know some of you may already be involved in youth adult partnerships and sharing power. But I want to just talk a little bit about power over young people versus power relationships, sharing power with young people. I don't know about you, but my background, my personal background as a Jamaican American, one thing that I learned in my culture coming up is that adults hold the power and young people were really to be seen and not heard. And there was an expectation that adults held power over young people. And I know there's some variation that you may all have in your personal experiences, but power over relationships really emphasize this traditional model where adults are dominant and they have control and they really run things based on their own self-interest or the interest of the system as they see it from their perspective. It doesn't even mean one might be malicious. One can have power over and work in a way that's domineering just because they think they're right and their perspective perspective is the way, right? Whereas if you wanted to share power with and engage in power with relationships, that's a model where, you know, you're focused more on dialogue, inclusion, sharing guided decision making, and so on. It's really shifting in a position. For me, excuse me, for me, it became a matter of learning how to shift and saying, hey, you know, I might have my own ideas here about how to proceed, but I'm also interested in learning your perspective and your ideas and see if we can come up with solutions together. So power with relationships really require a different posture than power over relationships. And so that's just one thing I wanted to share as well. And then if we go to the next slide. Now, I'm curious about this because, again, I know some of you may already be actively involved in efforts to share power with the youth. And given the great responses I've seen in the chat already, really want to see where you land. We don't have a formal poll, so if you could add more to the chat, I'd love to hear more about where you are on a scale of 1 to 4. So with 1 being not at all and 4 being to a large extent, to what extent does your SEA or LEA share power with youth? And if you really want to go further, please feel free to add a sentence or two to share why you selected that response. And let me open up the chat a little bit further here. Okay, I'm seeing some 1s, some 2s. There are a few 3s sprinkled throughout here. Okay. Anyone want to share why you shared that response? A 3.5. Okay. All right, so let's see. Sherry from New York said that students join some teams and committees, but not all, and with limited effect. All right. All right, Bethany from Texas, we include youth in strategic planning, but not in policy making. Okay. And then Stephanie says our district is trying to develop a student focus group. Okay. All right, so there's some variety as I would have thought, and that's okay. Just so you know, because I knew our time was really limited today, I kept the slides pretty short here, and I'd love to be able to go into more depth and really talk with you some more about that, but maybe we can have that conversation in the future if time allows. But I just want to say it's okay to be where you are on the scale. Like, my point here isn't to encourage you to be at a 4 or to shame you if you're at a 1. It's to really say, look at where you are as a system and think about your goals around sharing power with young people and start to make some steps to help you move up that scale, right? Especially if that is something that is important to you. And so I know that there are people who might, might struggle with that, but I think it's an honest perspective. You know, we talk about meeting young people where they are, and I think we should meet our systems where they are too, and figure out how to help move our systems forward. All right, so next slide, please. We've heard a little bit about equity already today, but let's get in a little bit more about equity with youth-adult partnerships. I wanted to share a few key points here. Next slide. So it's important really to engage young people who are central, or that is central to the population of focus that you want to make sure that their concerns are centered, their perspectives are centered, their insights are centered. You really want to think about whose voice matters in whatever it is that you're working on, right? That's a critical piece of this equity conversation. I can't tell you how many times I've been a part of efforts to engage young people, where the young people who are being selected and engaged as leaders even to speak on key issues are people who have no experience with the issue being addressed. So let's say you're dealing with young people who may be involved in the child welfare system, right? And they're also involved, of course, in your schools. And let's say you choose to engage youth leaders who are simply the top of their class. Not to say there can't be overlap between youth in the child welfare system and youth who are at the top of their class. If you do not make a point of centering young people with that experience in child welfare, you might end up having very irrelevant perspectives in your effort. And again, it seems really straightforward, and yet I can't tell you how often I've seen the young people whose voices should be centered not be included. That also, is a matter when you think about location, when you think about issues like race and gender and ethnicity, etc., sexual orientation. all of these factors should be considered when deciding who you really need to center. Of course, you want to have a diverse representative population when that's appropriate, and it often is appropriate, but you want to make sure that this diversity doesn't take you off track for who should be centered in your system, right? So you don't want diversity simply for diversity's sake. You want diversity that really represents the different voices of young people who can speak to that kind of issue that you're focusing on, or who speak to the location that you're focusing on, for instance, in your district or your state. Let's see, another point I wanted to share on this. When I think about creative ways to engage young people too. So when we think about equity, we realize that, you know, as the coach shared earlier, our systems are designed to get the results that they're getting, right? So when we look at some of the challenges with us reaching young people the way we really want to, we look at how is our system right now as it is, preventing the ones we want to include from being engaged. We look, are there barriers to them really feeling welcome? Are we using language that has them feel like they can be a part of this? Are we having images that represent them, right? So all the things that you might typically look for in other efforts related to equity apply as well when you start thinking about youth adult partnerships and engaging young people in meaningful ways in your systems. I'm a little worried about time, so let's move to the next slide. Just a few more considerations to wrap up for now. It's important to prepare youth and adults to share power. So I know we've talked about how, you know, the fact that sharing power is important, but preparing youth and adults for sharing power is important. So sometimes I find that it's important to work separately with youth and then separately with adults, because they've all been in the same environments before, but not in one in which power was shared. So if you're thinking about taking this on in your system, have some time to give adults and youth an opportunity to think about what would sharing power mean for them. Why is this something they want to do? What are some of their concerns and challenges around sharing power? But it's important to give them an opportunity to be prepared for doing something new, and also to have some vision for where they may be going. That preparation is critical. And again, it can be overlooked. Just because we've worked with young people in the past doesn't mean we've shared power with young people. We've had power over young people. So that's, again, one of the reasons why you want to prepare people for sharing power. You also want to think about incentives, and, you know, of course, incentives like finances to help, you know, cover people's time, because they could maybe be working rather than being a part of your advisory council or whatever structure you're coming up with to engage youth. You want to think about the incentive of, you know, making the opportunity meaningful, making sure that their voices really are being heard, they're really making a difference in these policies or in your structure or in your system, making sure that they're learning and receiving mentorship opportunities. Feedback that I hear from young people in terms of what they find incentivizes them has to do with them feeling connected even to the other people who are involved, feeling like they are cared for. So you want to definitely consider financial incentives, but go beyond financial incentives. And think about how you can also make sure that you have enough staff dedicated time so that your staff aren't, you know, sort of burnt out to giving youth the little bit of energy they might be able to muster. But think about how you can identify people who are able to really focus a bit of attention and be present and engaged with young people, to bring their voices into your system in new ways. I already talked a little bit about reflecting the population of focus when discussing equity, but it is really, really critical and something that we have to constantly pay attention to in our work. And then you want to diversify opportunities for engagement, right? So what I mean by this is that, you know, we have to ask young people all the time, you know, just how do you want to be engaged in this effort? Do you want to have a leadership role? Do you want to be running meetings, for instance, and planning agendas? Do you want to bring your voice to the table once we have a particular issue to decide on? Do you want to help us do research? We try to find different ways to meet young people where they are. And sometimes that allows them also to kind of grow in how they're engaged and how they contribute. So as you think about engaging young people as partners, recognize that it can look different, but what you want to do is not be the one who simply decides how young people would be engaged, but ask them how they'd like to be engaged, and think about how you can be creative and find new ways to have them work in partnership with you in your system. And then finally, of course, you know, while some of us get excited about engaging young people, it needs to make sense. Whatever you're doing needs to make sense for your initiative, for your system, for whatever it is you're working on, right? So you don't want to pull young people in a way that's only going to, unless you're just doing a focus group, right? You don't want to pull young people in ways that are going to really not work for your system. So for us, that would mean if we know that we don't have the bandwidth to continue to engage young people in helping to shape particular programs, we think about other ways that we can maintain over time, right? So what are sustainable ways that work for who we are as an organization, or that work for our goals, or that work for the level of buy-in we have from leadership, right? Those are some things to think about as you want to align your youth engagement efforts. I think that's all we might have time for today. So let me wrap and see if there are any comments. Thank you.
And we have a few more minutes. I think we go till, if I did this correct, till 10 after, and there is a question in chat. The question from Jason is, how do you center around certain groups without losing the diverse group of voices that you're targeting?
So Jason, I'd love to learn more about the specifics that you're trying to accomplish there. I know that we have to think about both and many times, and sometimes we need to select whose voices are centered at which points in time. So I don't know, are you on a SCA level, a district level? Would you be able to share more either in the chat or by speaking up? Okay, LEA level. So, okay, so I'm working with, school districts right now. Like one of the school districts I'm working with is thinking about their goals and their concerns around engaging young people in their district who are really struggling with mental health challenges and who are really concerned about mental health in the district. And they want to have a district-wide effort, but they also want to make sure that they're engaging the young people from the high schools in their district where the data shows that those young people should really be the ones being a focus. So they're in the early stages right now, but what they're doing is looking at their recruitment efforts that will really prioritize young people in the schools, in the sections of their districts where they know the data shows that those young people really need to be the ones of focus, right? So, you're going to lose maybe the voices of the young people who are not in those sort of priority schools in that particular effort. We know that there could be other ways that school district could go about it. And we know that there may be different ways to go about figuring out what works in your system. So I don't want to pretend there's a one size fits all approach here. But the key thing I wanted to say is we realize that, at least certainly in my efforts to engage youth and to support others in engaging youth, sometimes what happens is you water down the focus on a particular topic or particular issues by trying to include everyone, and then you have no one who's actually really a part of your key population. So I know I'm speaking generally because I know you might be focusing on different issues in your particular transformation efforts. But for me, when I was working with schools focused on mental health, we really wanted to focus on the young people who said, hey, this is something we care about. And then if we saw that there were bigger concerns among youth who were from particular communities, we would want to double down in those communities, or we'd want to figure out how do we then balance between focus in on a particular community or a particular subgroup of youth for certain conversations and still have a structure that allows us to engage the broader population of youth for other conversations. So I'm hoping that's helpful. If you can respond in the chat to let us know if that's helpful, that would be great, Jason. I see another question in the chat. Christina says, how do you address watering down the approach with addressing intersectionality? All right. Yeah, so in our work, Christine, I can tell you what we do, certainly. And again, this is not me saying everyone should do exactly what we do, but what we focus on is what are the key perspectives that we need to bring to the table, and how do we recruit for people who have that kind of life experience and that perspective to bring to the table, and that allows for intersectionality, right? But we try not to go to the point now where we are diversifying so much that we lose a sense of focus. I'm hoping that's helpful, right? So for us, there's a balance there. trying to create allies, and those other groups could be helpful. Okay, I think that was a response there to Christina. Christina, did you want to say more? Does that address your question?
Yes, I think it does help. I think sometimes when I've been in groups that try to think about particularly youth serving organizations and focusing on just one aspect of their identity, because there's a concern that we might be watering down the impact of the work if we look more wholly at their
Okay.
so
Yes.
like thinking
Okay.
about, for example, the intersections of race and poverty or race and gender, and that by adding some of those other aspects of their identity, it might unintentionally water down the focus of the work.
Got it. No, so we're not talking about singling out people based on an issue and therefore making that their whole story, right? So that's not at all what we do or what we recommend. So when I'm working with young people who they have multiple elements of their identity that we need to be considering, right? But we ask them, do you have lived experience related to X issue or Y issue? So when we're working on something about homeless youth, we look for young people who, of course, they have other aspects of their identity that they might want to even talk about and address, but we make sure that we're including young people who have that lived experience to bring to the table. And we don't then go talk to the young people who don't bring that lived experience to the table. That's really all I'm acknowledging. So depending on the issues, we decide which voices need to be prioritized at that moment. But the way that we work with them in overall acknowledges their full humanity and that they have a lot more to offer. And we don't engage homeless youth only on issues that are only about homelessness, right? So if an issue requires a focus on a particular population, that's when we get super clear. But when it's sort of an issue that can be addressed by people of many different identities, we then try to broaden up then too. So it's really about being intentional about when you focus and hone in and when you allow yourself to go broad. Does that address your question, Christina?
Very helpful. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, I know we're at 2:10 here. So my information is on the slide and I'll put my email in the chat as well if anyone wants to reach out. But thank you for the opportunity to talk with you.